Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
I was 20 years old when I sat at the kitchen table with my parents, holding a folded brochure from the state university, my hands damp with the sweat of someone who knows they're about to ask for something they probably won't get, but still hoping for a miracle. The college wasn't Ivy League, it wasn't flashy, it wasn't even out of state, it was just the local university with decent programs and professors who didn't mail in their lectures. I wanted to study communications, maybe journalism, something that would give me a way to escape the dead-end town we lived in. Tuition wasn't cheap, but it wasn't astronomical either. I thought if I showed them the breakdown, explained how I'd already saved from working summers at the diner, and asked just for some help with the remainder, they would understand this wasn't a whim. It was a chance at a future. My dad sighed before I'd even finished laying the paper on the table, like the sight of me preparing to speak was already a burden. He pushed the brochure back across the wood as though it were radioactive, muttering something about dreams that don't pay the bills. My stepmom, Kelly, sat across from me with her arms folded tight, her mouth pinched into a look that was half pity, half annoyance, the way people look at stray cats scratching at the door. Mom, well, she wasn't really mom to me. She was the woman who married my father when I was 12 and took over the role of explaining why we couldn't afford things. And on that particular afternoon, she launched into the usual litany: the mortgage, the car payment, the rising cost of groceries, the electric bill that nearly killed us last month. Dad nodded along like her accountant, shaking his head at the sheer impossibility of even considering sending me to school. The words, "we're broke," landed heavy, like a door slamming shut. I remember staring at them, trying to find a crack in their armor, but the performance was airtight. They insisted they loved me, that if times were different they'd help, but as it stood there was just no money. And then, the kicker, maybe I should look at community college, or better yet, keep working, save up, and see what life brings. The message was clear. Education wasn't a family investment, it was a selfish luxury, and I was naive for even asking. I walked away from that conversation feeling like I'd been slapped. It wasn't just disappointment, it was betrayal laced with humiliation, because deep down I had believed they might at least meet me halfway. Instead, I was told in no uncertain terms that my dreams were too expensive for their budget. So I doubled down at the diner, picking up night shifts and early mornings, dragging myself home smelling like grease and coffee grounds, telling myself it was temporary, that hard work would eventually carve out a place for me. Weeks went by in a blur of exhaustion. My coworkers joked about my college fund jar, which was really just a cracked coffee mug hidden in my locker, filled with small bills and tips that I guarded like treasure. It wasn't glamorous, but it was progress. And then one evening, when I finally had a few hours to myself, I logged onto Facebook, scrolling through the endless parade of acquaintances posting baby pictures, engagement rings, and inspirational quotes. And that was when I saw it. Tiffany, my stepmom's daughter, grinning ear to ear in front of a sparkling two-story house with a balloon arch framing the doorway. She was holding an oversized set of novelty keys like she had just won a game show. The caption read, "Can't believe it. Thanks to Mom and Dad for making this dream come true. New homeowner vibes." I sat frozen, my heart pounding so loud I could barely read the comments pouring in congratulations, heart emojis, people calling her so blessed. Blessed? Tiffany had never held a job longer than 3 months. She had flunked out of cosmetology school, lived rent-free at home, and spent most of her days posting selfies with captions about manifesting abundance. And now she was standing in front of a house apparently paid for by the very same people who had sworn to me, with stone faces and heavy sighs, that they couldn't spare a single dime. The betrayal was so sharp it felt physical. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred, replaying the conversation in the kitchen like a bad movie, hearing again the words, "we're broke," while looking at my stepsister holding proof that money had been flowing freely, just not in my direction. The realization sank in like cold water. It wasn't about the money at all. It was about worth. And in their eyes, I simply wasn't worth it. That night, lying awake in my small, suffocating room with the sound of the dishwasher humming through the wall, I couldn't stop asking myself the same question over and over. If they were so broke, how could they buy her that house? And if they could choose to invest in her so easily, what did that make me? Just the disposable daughter? The morning after Tiffany's ribbon-cutting spectacle, I walked into the diner with a smile that felt stapled onto my face, because I knew that if I let it slip even for a second, the whole room would see the raw, ugly hurt simmering under my skin. And I decided right then that if they thought I was naive enough to accept the word broke as a permanent verdict on my life, then I would learn the quiet arithmetic of getting even without making a scene, the kind that looks like endurance on the surface, but moves like strategy underneath. Between refilling coffee and scraping plates, I replayed the Facebook photo until every piece of it became useful evidence. The balloon art screaming money, the new lawn still showing seams where the sod had been rolled out, the stainless mailbox with a gleaming address plate, and Tiffany's caption thanking Mom and Dad, which was either sloppy truth or a slip of vanity, but either way it was a confession I could work with. That afternoon, I printed the photo at the pharmacy's 1-hour kiosk, tucked the glossy square into a manila folder with my tuition breakdown, my bank statements, the scholarship deadlines I had marked in red pen, and the name of a financial aid officer at the university whom one of my regulars, a retired guidance counselor who tipped in crumpled dollars and advice, had told me to call if I ever needed a grown-up who won't talk down to you. At home, I moved through the kitchen like a guest in my own life, while my dad pretended to study the sports section and Kelly bit into an apple with those tight, efficient jaws that always made me think of a paper shredder. I said I was headed to the library to look for used textbooks for community college, which was the kind of sentence she loved because it sounded obedient and inexpensive, and she nodded without lifting her eyes, which told me I could disappear for hours and not be missed. I drove straight to the university instead, parked in the visitor lot that smelled like hot asphalt and cut grass, and walked into the financial aid office with my cheap flats clicking on the tile like they were trying to convince the building I belonged there. The woman behind the counter, her badge said Marla, had the patient face of someone who has seen every shape of panic. From kids convinced one late form would ruin their lives to parents who showed up certain the entire system was rigged against their genius offspring. When I said I had been told there was no money at home and I needed to learn what counted as proof of independence for aid, her eyes softened, but her voice stayed businesslike, which I appreciated more than pity. She explained the documentation, the letters, the timeline, the way certain circumstances could shift the calculation of expected family contribution even when families insisted they had nothing to give. And while she spoke, I slid the photo of Tiffany's house across the desk, not with melodrama, but with the quiet precision of someone submitting an exhibit, and I said that if anyone ever asked why I was here alone, they should know that the word broke had recently paid for a balloon arch and a key shaped like a cartoon. By the time I left, I had a checklist, 3 application portals bookmarked, 2 essay prompts outlined in my head, and a meeting set for the following week to review my file, and while none of that replaced money, it did something better in that moment. It gave me leverage and language, it gave me a way to stop begging and start petitioning, and it told me that the story I had been fed could be revised if I learned to footnote it correctly. On the drive home, I phoned Aunt Denise, my mother's sister by blood and a woman who never forgot a slight even when she couldn't remember where she left her glasses, and I told her softly, almost apologetically, that I was organizing my fall classes alone because things were tight at home, and then, as if the thought had just fluttered into my mind, I mentioned how beautiful Tiffany's new place looked online and how generous it was of Dad and Kelly to make that dream come true. I did not add any opinion. I let the arithmetic do the work. By dinner, the quiet revenge had begun its ripple, my phone lit with messages that pretended to be casual, but burned with curiosity, cousins asking if the post was real, Grandma Elaine forwarding heart emojis followed by a question about whether I had chosen my dorm, Aunt Denise composing a group text with the subtlety of a trumpet, praising responsible parenting while attaching a cropped version of the house photo like a subpoena. And within an hour, my dad's face had that papery gray look he gets when he knows the family grapevine is circling his neck. Kelly called the post misleading, declared that family help could mean many things, and then snapped that I should stop stirring the pot when I asked, with an innocence I barely had to fake, whether generosity counted only when cameras were present. I slept well for the first time in weeks, not because anything had been fixed, but because something had shifted in the balance, because I had stopped carrying their secret for them. And in the morning, I added the scholarship portals to my bookmarks at the diner's back computer and drafted essays between orders, shaping sentences that turned humiliation into purpose, while Tiffany uploaded a house tour video with a voiceover about manifesting stability that made my cook roll his eyes so hard. I thought he might sprain something. When I came home that night, the living room was empty except for a printout on the coffee table, an amortization schedule with my father's scribbles in the margins, and a sticky note that read, "Do not leave this lying around." Which would have been funny if it weren't so telling, because the numbers showed a down payment that did not match any broke I had ever met and a loan structure that only made sense if someone had co-signed. And while I put the paper back exactly where I found it, my hands shook with a mixture of anger and possibility as I wondered whether their golden purchase had a hidden hinge I could pry, and whether the keys Tiffany waved at the camera might also lock them into something they could not easily escape. In the days after finding that amortization schedule abandoned on the coffee table like a guilty conscience that had wandered off for a glass of water, I moved through my shifts with a kind of wired calm that felt new in my body. A steadiness that came from understanding that I was no longer pleading for fairness, but cataloging facts, printing them, filing them, and arranging them like chess pieces I didn't have to move yet, because simply knowing which squares were mine had already changed the game. I added extra hours at the diner and picked up an overnight stocking shift at the grocery store 3 blocks away, so my life became a loop of fluorescent lights and grocery pallets and the sweet burn of coffee that was never hot enough. A loop that would have felt like punishment, except that each deposit into my cracked tip mug now carried a charge, because while my wrists ached and my knees complained, the map in my head kept brightening with what I could do next, and the ache angry people call hunger turned into something closer to appetite. The housewarming invitation traveled through the family like a perfume sample, sliding into group texts and Facebook stories, and a chirpy email blast with a photo of Tiffany holding a gold foil balloon shaped like the word home. And although it never came to me directly, I did not need a formal envelope to understand that my absence had been carefully curated, framed as a limited space issue by Kelly and a no hard feelings gloss by Tiffany, who captioned one clip with, "Sometimes you just have to protect your peace," as if my presence, my audacity to want school, was a contagion they had barely survived. I watched the comments pile up, "So proud of you, you deserve this, real queens build equity," and I felt that old shame flicker, then die, as I opened the event page and typed a single RSVP in the public thread that read, with the politeness of a customer service email and the precision of a scalpel, that I would be working a double that night to cover tuition since family resources were tight, and that I wished the new homeowner a lifetime of leak-free roofs and honest paperwork. The comment did not scream or accuse, yet it detonated under the lacquered table of our family image, because it forced a choice between pretending not to understand my meaning or acknowledging that everyone had understood for weeks. And within an hour I received a text from my father that was half scold, half plea, telling me to stop embarrassing the family and reminding me, with that paternal righteousness he wore like a badge, that gratitude was a virtue I seemed determined to ignore. I replied with a message so calm it might as well have been a weather report, noting that gratitude and secrecy weren't synonyms, and that if our people were going to applaud philanthropy, they might as well know who received the scholarships. My quieter revenge moved along a second track, because while the RSVP made ripples, the tide came from documentation, and on a lunch break I sat in the university computer lab and searched the county property records, typing Tiffany's street address with the kind of patience that comes when you suspect the last page of the book will not disappoint you. The deed appeared in the database with a scanned signature I recognized as my father's, the mortgage documents listing him as a co-borrower alongside Kelly, which meant that the story of generosity as one-time gift had been, at best, a half-truth, and at worst, a deliberate cover for an ongoing obligation that tied their fortunes to Tiffany's ability to act like a grown-up for longer than a news cycle. I printed the page and tucked it next to the amortization schedule and the balloon arch photo, the documents forming a triptych that told a story more efficiently than any speech I could give, and on my way out I slipped into the financial aid office to hand Marla an updated copy of my file, saying lightly that my household's expected contribution might need reevaluation now that expectations had found new dependents. By the time Thanksgiving crept around with its casseroles and its insistence on gratitude, the family chat had split into polite cousins who posted recipes and sharp-tongued aunts who posted questions, all of which I ignored, choosing instead to show up with a store-bought pie, a clean shirt that had survived the diner's grease storms, and a smile I had ironed flat during my walk from the car. Dinner began with the usual clatter of serving spoons, the too loud compliments about the turkey, the grandfather who wanted to know if my little job offered benefits yet, and then Aunt Denise, acting like a choir director winding up for a hymn, raised her glass and congratulated Tiffany on her first mortgage payment, adding with sugar-dipped innocence that it was a blessing to have parents willing to co-sign for the future, at which point the room tightened like a fist and my father's eyes landed on me as if I were the fuse in a firework he hadn't meant to buy. The argument that followed did not become a screaming match because I refused to raise my voice, and if that enraged my father more than anything else, that was a cost I was willing to pay. Since there is a different kind of power in watching a man sputter while you answer him with evenly spaced truths, I said that I had not lied, that I had not shared anything untrue, that the words, "we are broke," could not coexist with a co-signed mortgage and a party that required a balloon arch, and when he ordered me to stop, turning the family against itself, I said the family had chosen its teams already and that I had simply stopped wearing the wrong jersey. He told me, with the finality of a slammed lid, that if I couldn't respect the house, I shouldn't come back to it, and although the sentence felt like a push down a stairwell, I steadied myself with the railing of something sturdier than belonging. Because the printout in my folder had already whispered a more interesting truth, one I would have to decide how to use. The house that had been used to measure my worth was also a lever attached to their names, and levers, once noticed, do not vanish just because someone declares the subject off limits. After the Thanksgiving tension had faded into the usual hum of everyday life, I began to feel a kind of calm clarity I had not known before. The kind that arrives not as relief, but as an awareness that your place in the world has been misjudged for years, and that the only way to reclaim your footing is to build your own platform, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. And so I threw myself into my studies with a ferocity I had never known, attending every lecture, taking notes with a meticulous hand, memorizing formulas and essays and deadlines as though each one were a shield against the family's favoritism, and in the evenings I worked extra shifts at the diner, often skipping lunch so I could afford the cheapest textbooks and a notebook thick enough to hold all my calculations, outlines, and ideas, knowing that every hour spent now would pay off in autonomy I could feel in my chest like a beating drum. While I poured energy into my own path, Tiffany continued to flaunt the life my parents had enabled, posting carefully curated photos of her newly decorated living room, her shoes on the polished floor, and snippets of her mornings with avocado toast and freshly brewed coffee, each image a reminder that the family's resources had been siphoned away from me and poured into her lap with the kind of ease that made my teeth ache, and yet, with each post, I began to notice subtle cracks that nobody else seemed to see. The furniture looked new but cheaply made, the bills she posted about her mortgage were vague and incomplete, and the smiles she offered to the camera had a stiffness that betrayed anxiety, not joy. My instincts, honed by years of watching my parents prioritize appearances over substance, told me that there was a hinge in this story, a lever hidden behind her perfect Instagram, and I started to track it quietly, noting when bills came due, when property taxes were announced, and how her posts often coincided with calls to my father that lasted longer than they should have. It was during a late-night study session that I stumbled across a revelation so sharp it cut through my exhaustion like a scalpel. The mortgage for Tiffany's house, which had been celebrated as a gift, had in fact been co-signed by my parents, meaning that legally they were still responsible if she defaulted, and the numbers on the document suggested that any lapse on her part would create a chain reaction that could financially wound them far more than their denial of my tuition ever had. I printed the document and added it to my growing collection of files that already included the balloon arch photo, the amortization schedule, and the deed record, forming a dossier that whispered possibilities rather than threats. Each page a subtle reminder that leverage is not always loud, and sometimes the quietest observation carries the most weight. Armed with these details, I began to employ a careful strategy during family gatherings, planting casual observations into conversations that appeared innocent but carried weight, noting offhand that some friends had warned about co-signed loans, or that it was interesting how new homeowners sometimes mismanaged responsibilities despite appearances, and while nobody explicitly connected the dots, I could see the unease ripple across their faces, a flicker in my father's eyes and a tightening of Kelly's jaw, a silent acknowledgement that the story had shifted, that the narrative I had been excluded from now contained truths they could not ignore. Meanwhile, my own life continued to advance in ways that they had deemed impossible, with scholarship applications submitted, essays revised under the fluorescent hum of the diner back office, and acceptance letters slowly accumulating in my inbox. Each one a small vindication of my persistence and my refusal to accept the limitations they had imposed on me, and as I walked across the campus with textbooks balanced against my side, I felt the sweet satisfaction of self-determination, a sense that the world, though still constrained by bills and obligations, could not deny my capacity to carve out a place where my worth was recognized. The tipping point came one evening when my father called, ostensibly to ask about my classes, and I answered in measured tones, reporting the latest deadlines and financial updates, while slipping into the conversation a casual mention that Tiffany's mortgage appeared unusually large compared to her reported income, phrased with such nonchalance that he could not respond without revealing his own oversight. And I listened as a tension built in his voice that mirrored the tension I had carried for years, a quiet acknowledgement that his attempts to conceal the truth were crumbling, and that the power balance in the house was beginning to tilt in ways he had never anticipated. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of satisfaction that was not triumphant but deliberate, a knowledge that I had initiated a chain reaction that could bring consequences without me lifting a finger, that the system they had used to measure my worth could now measure theirs, and as I closed my folder and looked out the window at the quiet street below, I understood with a calm certainty that revenge did not always require confrontation, and that sometimes the most devastating outcomes are those orchestrated with patience, precision, and the quiet accumulation of undeniable facts. The weeks that followed Tiffany's financial missteps unfolded like a slow, inevitable tide, one that I watched with the patient calm of someone who had learned to measure time not in hours or days, but in leverage and opportunity, because every mismanaged payment, every forgotten invoice, every glossy post that hid anxiety beneath a perfect smile became a small node in a web I had been constructing quietly for months, and as the rumors about her mortgage began circulating among family members, subtly prompted by comments I had placed with gentle precision and phrasing that suggested concern rather than accusation, I felt the power of the truth I had gathered settling like weight in my chest. A mix of vindication and the strange satisfaction of anticipating consequences that had nothing to do with my voice being loud enough to demand attention. It was Thanksgiving revisited, this time not in the calendar sense, but in the feeling that family gatherings were now a minefield where every word and gesture carried more impact than before, and when my father attempted his usual pretense of authority, telling me that I should be grateful for the opportunities they had allegedly provided, I remained calm, letting my presence itself communicate what I had learned and how the rules of engagement had shifted, because my calmness was louder than any outburst, and my ability to look him in the eye without flinching was a declaration that I had mastered the only weapon they could never confiscate: knowledge. I refused to participate in the conversations about Tiffany's latest house upgrades, and when my mother tried to frame me as bitter and jealous, I simply smiled, knowing that the documents in my folder, which had become a living ledger of truth, could speak louder than any accusation, because the deed, the amortization schedule, the mortgage co-signing details, and the inconsistencies between Tiffany's social media displays and her financial reality formed an unassailable record that traced back to every misrepresentation and every claim of scarcity my parents had offered me, a record that now hovered over the room like a silent verdict, waiting for someone brave enough or careless enough to acknowledge it. Then came the moment I had been preparing for, a quiet encounter that demanded nothing from me but my attention, when my father, under the pretense of casual conversation, asked if I could help Tiffany with a few financial questions. As if I had some magical insight to correct what had gone wrong, and I paused, feeling the balance of power rest entirely on my shoulders, and in that pause I recognized the culmination of months of careful observation, planning, and silent strategy. Because I could answer, I could step in and restore order, or I could let events run their natural course, a course that would inevitably reveal the discrepancy between appearances and reality. I chose the latter, and in the most measured tone I could muster, I explained that while I understood the questions and could offer guidance, I had learned through experience that lessons are best absorbed when they are earned. That responsibility cannot be transferred by co-signing a check or framing a loan as a gift, and that sometimes the best help is no help at all, and as the words left my lips, I saw the shift immediately, the tightening of my father's face, the flash of irritation and fear in my mother's eyes, and the subtle, unreadable change in Tiffany, who seemed for the first time to realize that the house that had been a symbol of parental favor was also a burden she had yet to comprehend fully. As I walked away that evening, leaving the house behind with the quiet satisfaction that I had not acted out of malice, but from the deliberate application of patience and observation, I understood that the culmination of this saga was not the destruction of Tiffany or even the embarrassment of my parents, but the reclamation of my own agency. The ability to navigate a world that had undervalued me and to transform knowledge into a shield that neither pride nor wealth could dislodge. And when I later drove past Tiffany's house, seeing the balloons long deflated, the driveway empty, and the faint shadows moving inside, I felt a sense of completion that was both bittersweet and empowering, because the victory I claimed was not public, it was not loud. It was the quiet truth that I had endured, calculated, and emerged not merely unbroken, but undeniably sovereign in a space that my parents had once tried to confine me to, leaving me with the lingering, contemplative question of whether power lies in wealth, in inheritance, or in the calm, measured understanding of when to act and when to let consequences speak for themselves.